So the two British poets that probably you think of most when you read Philip Larkin are Thomas Hardy and William Butler Yeats. Hardy, you'll remember, was really a master of combining seemingly casual speech with traditional verse forms. So you would read a Hardy poem and sometimes even forget that the poem would rhyme or forget that the poem would be written in regular meter because Hardy was so good at capturing the rhythms of everyday speech. Not only that, Hardy was really interested in the gap between expectation and reality, what we want from life and what we get from life. And often, in the case of Hardy, this gap between desire and fact leads to grim comedy. Yeats, mainly in his middle period, what I often call his conversational period, also found a way to capture a blend of conversational speech and traditional verse forms. I think of Adam's Curse, for instance. And in that middle period, like Hardy, Yeats explored the gap between what we want from life and what we get from life, and ultimately concludes that life, no matter how hard we strive, will be difficult and disappointing. So, what are we meant to do with that? And even though Yeats doesn't take the turn to comedy like Hardy does, there's still a sense of resignation and affirmation in those poems from the middle phase, from say 1900 to the mid 19 teens. So Larkin is writing his best poetry really from say the mid 1950s to the mid 1970s. And we see in Larkin a sort of update of Hardy and Yeats, mainly of Hardy, I would say. And a good way to start thinking about Larkin and his connection to this tradition is to look at his famous poem called Church Going. So let's first think about the form. The poem is made of several 9-line stanzas. These stanzas are written in pentameter. Almost all the lines have 10 syllables, and largely written in iambic pentameter, though there is in the poem an interplay between lines that certainly don't scan to equal perfect iambic pentameter and lines that are rendered in perfect iambic pentameter. So there is metrically a hint toward traditional form and a hint toward the comfort that traditional form can provide, da 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 da, but also a sense that these traditional forms and the comforts that they provide don't quite fit the experience of living in England in 1954, which was when Church Going was written. We also have throughout these 9-line stanzas rhyme, but the rhymes are often slant rhyme, suggesting again a nod toward the comfort of rhyme, the symmetry suggested by rhyme, the idea that there can be concord between sounds suggested by rhyme, but then also the sense that in reality, these symmetries rarely exist. These comforting sounds rarely exist. So, for instance, in the first stanza, we see, "Once I am sure there's nothing going on, I step inside, letting the door thud shut. Another church, matting, seats, and stone, and little books, sprawlings of flowers, cut for Sunday, brownish now, some brass and stuff, upon the holy end, the small neat organ, and a tense, musty, unignorable silence, brewed God knows how long. Hatless, I take off my cycle clips in awkward reverence." So we have in the first 4 lines, cut, shut, and cut rhyme perfectly, but on and stone do not. That's a slant rhyme. And then if we go further down, we can see that stuff is matched with off, another slant rhyme. And silence and reverence rhyme pretty well, together, but we have at least 2 slant rhymes in that stanza. Not only that, we can look at the meter and how it varies from line to line. The first line, I would say, is scans in iambic pentameter. Once I am sure there's nothing going on, I emphasize the syllables to give you that sense. So Larkin establishes this is a traditional British line, iambic pentameter, but then in the next line, he varies that pattern. I step inside, that's iambic, I'm letting the door thud shut. So that last foot, thud shut, would be a spondaic foot. Certainly that emphasizes the sound of the door thudding shut, boom, right? But also it varies that metrical pattern. So Larkin is playful with his meter throughout. Now, the themes of the poem match with these formal elements. These formal elements, again, suggest a kind of symmetry and order and comfort, and establish expectations for that symmetry, order, and comfort, but diverge, I should say, swerve from those categories, suggesting that there's a gap in life between what we want and what we get. So one way that Larkin expresses this is by, as a secular speaker, going into a church, thinking about the traditional expectations that a church would have, and wondering, how do you behave in a church which still carries with it some kind of ancient mystique? How do you behave in this church when you yourself no longer believe in the dogmas of the church? So let's look a little bit closer at this first stanza. The speaker says, once I'm sure there's nothing going on, meaning I'm looking around to make sure there's no one in the church actually doing something like holding a service, I step inside and the door slams behind me. And what is it? Oh, it's just another church. It's nothing special. There's matting here, there's seats here, there's stone. There are little books everywhere. He doesn't say what they are. He doesn't say, oh, these are hymnals or these are choir books. Sprawlings of flowers cut for Sunday, brownish now. So the beautiful flowers that would be there Sunday are now brown. So again, this sense of decline, this sense of things not being as colorful and beautiful as one might want them to be. What else is in this church? Some brass and stuff. So this is classic Larkin, that he's using a sort of everyday vernacular. Well, that's what vernacular is. He's using a vernacular, a very casual vernacular, to talk about something, a church that's usually associated with grand language. So instead of describing what these beautiful brass objects are, he just says, oh, there's some brass and stuff, using very ordinary language. We normally don't see this kind of language in poetry in the 1950s, and certainly we don't see it in the poetry of, say, a Yeats or a Hardy. So Larkin is pushing poetry even more toward the everyday, toward the casual, than his 2 main influencers did. Some brass and stuff. Up at the holy end. Again, the vague language, not, this is where the altar is, or this is where the pulpit is. Sorry, my cat is very interested in what I'm saying. But it's just the holy end. There's a little organ there. And then look at the precision. A tense, unignorable silence. Brood how long God knows. I don't have a hat on, so I have to take my hat off. Hatless, I take off my cycle clips in awkward reverence. So I'm not going to take my hat off. I don't have one, but I feel like I need to do something to show that I'm aware that I'm in a church. So I'll take off the clips I put on my pants so they don't get caught in my chain in my bicycle. So you see what's going on here. I don't believe in what this church stands for, but yet I still feel that there's some sort of presence here that I should acknowledge. So he continues in this way and tells us basically what it's like to move through a church in this way. And the comedy persists, the comedy embodied by taking off his bicycle clips as an act of reverence. I move forward, I run my hand along the font. From where I stand, the roof looks almost new, cleared or restored. Cleared or restored. Someone would know. Someone would know. I don't know. I don't. Again, he's approaching this church as if he doesn't really know much about it. He's being very honest. He's being very frank about it. Mounting the lecture, I peruse a few hectoring large-scale verses and pronounce, "Here endeth," much more loudly than I'd meant. The echoes snigger briefly. Back at the door, I sign the book, donate an Irish sixpence, reflect the place was not worth stopping for. So here's more of the comedy. It's almost like a slapstick comic routine where because he's in a church, he suddenly feels very solemn, he feels very serious. So he uses the kind of language that might be used in the King James Bible, and he speaks it more loudly than he normally would, feeling like he should speak with self-importance because it's a church. And his language echoes through the church in a way that's a little embarrassing to him. The echoes snigger, they laugh. And so when he leaves, he puts an Irish sixpence in the slot as a way of donating to the church. But of course, an Irish coin would have no meaning, no value in a British church. So there's the comedy we see. And basically, the rest of the poem shows us Larkin trying to understand why he felt the need to behave like he did in this church environment. What is it about this church, even though I'm not a believer, that made me behave like I did, a way that was ultimately quite comical? And he says, well, gosh, what's going to happen to churches when they fall out of use? He says, I often come here and I often end up at a loss. Like, what's the meaning of this building now? And what should I do? What should I look for in this building that doesn't have any metaphysical significance to me? And what will happen to churches when no one comes to church anymore, when no one believes anymore? Will they be places where we keep sheep? Will we start avoiding them as if they're unlucky places? Will we become superstitious about them? Or will dubious women come, women who are full of doubt, bring their children and have them touch some particular stone? Again, will these places become sites of superstition? And he goes on to think about other things that might happen in the future. And then he shifts from that to saying, well, after a long, long time, people will even wonder what these buildings were for. A shape less recognizable each week, this church will be. A purpose more obscure. I wonder who will be the very last to seek this place for what it was. One of the crew that tap and jot and know what rude lofts were. Someone who still knows what the specialized language of the church is, which he, of course, doesn't. Some ruined bibber randy for antique or Christmas addict counting on a whiff of gown and bands and organ pipes and myrrh? Or will he be my representative? Or will the person coming into the church when no one really knows what it's for anymore, will the person coming into the church, perhaps the very last person to come into a church, will he be someone who's like a historian or an antique collector? Or will he be like me, bored, uninformed, knowing the ghostly silt dispersed, yet tending to the cross of ground through suburb scrub because it held unspilt so long, and equably what sense is found only in separation, marriage and birth and death and thoughts of these, for which was built this special shell? For though I've no idea that what this accoutred frosty barn is for, it pleases me to stand in silence here. So this is the great Larkin move. The first 3/4 of the poem, he's basically saying this church has lost its gleam. It's lost its power. But yet I will try to mimic the activities that once had power. And it will be funny. It will be slapsticky because I don't take this church very seriously. It's ultimately a place that's losing all value. And the only real reason to think about it is to think about what it's going to be like over the years when it loses all of its power and what will happen to it then. Will it be a barn? Will it be a place of superstition? Will it be a place where antique dealers come? But then the very last stanza, he finds a power to the church that is not religious power, but a kind of secular power. He says, because this is a building where marriages have taken place, where births have taken place, where deaths have been acknowledged, it has a seriousness to it. And even though it lacks metaphysical force, it is still a site where life feels worthy and deep and uh, something that should be contemplated. So there's a shift from, metaphysically speaking, the church has lost its power, but it still has a kind of psychological and emotional power, especially for a poet like Larkin, who also makes constructions in words that aren't religious, but they still want to address the great concerns of humanity. So here's the final stanza. A serious house on serious earth it is, this church, in whose blent air all our compulsions meet, are recognized and robed as destinies. And that much never can be obsolete, since someone will forever be surprising a hunger in himself to be more serious, and gravitating with it to this ground, which he once heard was proper to grow wise in, if only that so many dead lie round. This is a place to be serious in a world that is decreasingly serious. This is a place to come think about what it all means. Now, Larkin is rarely straight for long. So notice that in the penultimate line, the awkward syntax, which he once heard, the person going into the church to think about seriousness, was proper to grow wise in. That's a very awkward syntax, which of course suggests that there is something strange and tense and odd about this. To go into a building that has no intrinsic seriousness, but still be serious there. So there's still that gap between reality and expectation, but instead of using this gap as a place for humor, mockery, Larkin instead sees it as a place to come and rise to a kind of contemplative rigor that one would normally not exhibit.